I founded my company 42 years ago. Then one morning I opened my inbox and found an email that said my executive access had been suspended. Not by strangers, not by competitors, by the company carrying my own family name. A few seconds later, my son's message appeared on my phone. "Dad, it's time to step aside gracefully. The future can't wait for you forever." He thought he was pushing an old man out of the way. What Ryan didn't know was that someone had already prepared for the day he tried. Let me take you back to how it all started. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life I measured time by work. I started Bennett Logistics with a single truck and a rented warehouse that leaked every time it rained. There were years when I slept in my office because I couldn't afford both a mortgage and payroll. Years when my wife, Ellen, handled invoices at our kitchen table while raising our children. Every building, every customer, every contract had a story behind it. Nothing came easy. That was why losing Ellen 2 years earlier felt like losing half of myself. She had been my partner in every sense of the word. After she passed away, I kept showing up to work, but something changed. I no longer wanted 12-hour days. I no longer wanted to fight every battle. I thought it was time to let the next generation take more responsibility. My son Ryan seemed eager to do exactly that. At first I was proud. He was smart, confident, ambitious, the kind of young executive investors liked. His wife Vanessa was equally ambitious. She constantly talked about expansion, modernization, and transforming the company. At first I welcomed their energy. I thought they were helping carry the weight. I didn't realize they were slowly taking the weight away from me altogether. The first signs were small, easy to dismiss. During executive meetings, I would offer suggestions based on experience. Ryan would smile politely and say things like, "Dad, that's how things worked 20 years ago." Or, "The market is different now." The first few times I ignored it. Every generation thinks they're smarter than the last. I remembered being young myself, but the comments became more frequent, more pointed. One afternoon we were discussing a major shipping contract. I explained why the customer might become a long-term risk. I'd worked with similar companies before. Ryan barely let me finish. "That's not how business works anymore." The room went quiet. Several managers looked down at their notes. Nobody challenged him. Nobody asked me to continue. The meeting simply moved on. For the first time, I felt something uncomfortable. Not anger. Replacement. When I returned home that evening, I sat alone on my porch and stared at Ellen's empty chair. I found myself wishing she were there. She always noticed things before I did, especially when it came to people. The weeks passed. The pattern continued. More decisions happened without my input. More meetings ended before I was informed they had even started. Ryan always had explanations. "We didn't want to bother you. You've earned some rest." We handled it. Every excuse sounded reasonable until they started adding up. Then came Vanessa. Unlike Ryan, she didn't hide her opinions. At family dinners, she made comments disguised as jokes. "The company finally feels modern." Or, "It's amazing how much faster things move now." Everyone would laugh politely. I usually smiled. But I noticed something. The jokes always had a target. One Sunday evening, I overheard Vanessa speaking with relatives in the dining room. She didn't realize I was nearby. "When everything officially becomes Ryan's, we'll be able to make real changes. Everything officially becomes Ryan's." The words stayed with me. I had never announced retirement, never discussed ownership transfers. Yet people were already talking as if the company belonged to someone else. For the first time, I began paying attention. A few months later, something happened that was impossible to ignore. I arrived at the office and noticed several department heads leaving a conference room. They looked surprised to see me. One manager hesitated. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett." "Morning," I replied. "What was the meeting about?" The room became awkward. The manager glanced toward Ryan's office. It was an executive strategy session. I stared at him. "I wasn't invited." His face immediately changed. "I assumed you knew." I didn't. That afternoon I walked into Ryan's office. He barely looked up from his laptop. Why wasn't I included in today's meeting? Oh, he said casually. We didn't think it was necessary. Necessary. I spent 4 decades building that company. Apparently my presence was no longer necessary. Ryan continued typing. We're trying to streamline decision-making. I nodded slowly. Then I left. The conversation bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Not because of the meeting, because of how easy it had become for him to exclude me, as if he had already grown comfortable doing it. The next few weeks brought more surprises. Internal reports stopped arriving at my office. Financial summaries disappeared from my inbox. Project updates were suddenly harder to access. Every time I asked questions, someone had an explanation, a technical issue, a communication mistake, an oversight. Too many oversights. Then I overheard something that made my stomach tighten. 2 employees were talking near the break room. One said, I heard Mr. Bennett is basically retired now. The other nodded. That's what Ryan told us. Retired. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had informed me. My own employees were learning about my future before I was. I confronted Ryan again. This time he seemed irritated. Dad, people are just preparing for transition. What transition? He leaned back in his chair. The inevitable one. I looked at him for several seconds. Then I walked away before saying something I would regret. For days I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. The inevitable one. Not if, when. As though my role in the company was already over. As though the decision had already been made. Then came the moment that changed everything. I was reviewing financial paperwork when I discovered several authorization changes. At first I thought it was an administrative error. Then I checked again. My banking permissions had been removed from multiple company accounts. Removed. Not modified. Not updated. Removed. I called accounting immediately. The controller sounded nervous. Ryan approved the changes. My chest tightened. I drove straight to headquarters. Ryan met me in his office. Vanessa happened to be there as well. I placed the paperwork on the desk. Explain this. Ryan barely glanced at it. It's part of our restructuring process. You removed my authority. We simplified the approval system. I looked directly at him. I founded this company. Vanessa crossed her arms. Founders don't need to manage daily operations forever. There was something cold in her voice. Something final. For the first time, I no longer felt confused. I felt pushed. Deliberately, carefully, systematically. And deep down, I knew things were about to get worse. Because people don't remove a man's authority one piece at a time unless they're planning to take the rest. A week after discovering those authorization changes, I started noticing something else. People stopped looking me in the eye. Not everyone. Most of the warehouse supervisors still treated me the same. The drivers still waved when I walked through the yard. But inside the executive offices, something had shifted. Conversations ended when I entered rooms. Managers suddenly became careful with their words. It was the kind of atmosphere you feel before you understand it. And I hated it. One Monday morning, I arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. I planned to review quarterly reports before the rest of the staff arrived. When I opened my office door, my assistant looked uncomfortable. Morning, Sandra. Good morning, Mr. Bennett. She hesitated. Something wrong? Her eyes dropped. I thought Ryan already told you. Told me what? She looked genuinely nervous. Your office relocation. For a moment, I thought I had heard her incorrectly. My what? The executive floor renovation. I stared at her. Nobody had mentioned any renovation. Sandra opened a folder and handed me a document. According to the plan, my office was being moved from the executive floor to a smaller office near the archives department. A room barely larger than a storage space. My corner office had overlooked the company yard for 20 years. From that window, I had watched the business grow from 50 employees to more than 700. Now I was apparently being relocated without anyone even informing me. I walked straight to Ryan's office. He wasn't surprised to see me. In fact, he almost looked prepared. "Dad." "My office." Ryan sighed. "It's a better use of space." "For who?" "For the executive team." I studied his face. There wasn't a trace of guilt, only impatience. As though I was slowing down a process that had already been decided. Before I could respond, Vanessa entered carrying several folders. She stopped when she saw me. Then she smiled politely. The new office should be quieter, quieter. The way people talk about retirement homes. I left without another word. That afternoon, I sat alone in my office staring through the window. For the first time in my life, I felt like a guest inside my own company. The following month brought an even bigger shock. Bennett Logistics was celebrating its 42nd anniversary. Every year we hosted a company-wide event. Employees, managers, board members, major clients. It was one of the few traditions Ellen had loved. She used to spend weeks helping organize it. This year felt different from the beginning. Ryan was handling everything personally. Every detail, every presentation, every speech. I assumed he simply wanted more responsibility. I was wrong. The ballroom was packed that evening. More than 300 people attended. Large screens surrounded the stage. Employees laughed and talked while dinner was served. For a few hours, everything felt normal. Then Ryan walked onto the stage. The lights dimmed. A presentation appeared behind him. At first, it looked like a standard corporate speech. Revenue, growth, expansion plans, future goals. Then the title changed. The next chapter of Bennett Logistics. The room applauded. Ryan smiled. "Our company has entered a new era." Felt my stomach tighten. Something wasn't right. The next slide appeared. New leadership structure. Ryan's name sat at the top. Several executives had already been reassigned. Then I saw my own name. Founder Emeritus, advisory role. I froze. Nobody had discussed this with me. Nobody had asked my permission. The audience applauded again. I heard people cheering. My own removal was being celebrated. Publicly, Ryan continued, speaking. "My father built an incredible foundation, but every organization must eventually move forward." The words sounded respectful. The message wasn't. I looked around the room. Many people assumed I had approved everything. Some even smiled at me. They thought this was a planned transition, only I knew it wasn't. When the presentation ended, dozens of people congratulated Ryan. Several executives shook his hand. I quietly left before the event was over. The next morning, Ryan asked me to meet him privately. When I entered his office, Vanessa was already there. That immediately told me the conversation had been planned. Ryan folded his hands. "Dad, we need to discuss the future." I remained silent. He continued. "The board supports restructuring." Vanessa nodded. "The company needs stronger leadership going forward." I looked directly at her. "And you believe that leadership isn't me?" She didn't even hesitate. "The company needs leadership, not nostalgia." The room became silent. Ryan didn't correct her, didn't defend me, didn't even look uncomfortable. That hurt more than the words themselves, because at that moment, I realized this wasn't just business, it was personal. Ryan leaned forward. "We want to move you into an honorary advisory position. Honorary.A. Title without authority. Respect. Without power. They wanted my name, just not my control." As I left the office, I noticed both of them looked relaxed, confident, victorious. They truly believed the battle was over. What they didn't know was that a phone call was coming. Phone call that would change everything. I thought I knew about my late wife, my company, and the plans my son had been making behind my back. The call came 3 days later. I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee when my phone rang. The screen showed the name of our company attorney, Michael Graves. Michael had worked with Bennett Logistics for nearly 20 years. He wasn't the kind of man who called without a reason. "Harold," he said, "I think we need to meet." There was something in his voice that immediately got my attention. That afternoon, I met him at his office. After a few minutes of small talk, he opened a folder and slid it across the desk. I've been waiting a long time to show you this. Inside were legal documents I had never seen before. At the bottom of several pages was Ellen's signature. My wife's signature. I looked up at him. What is this? Michael leaned back. 3 years before she passed away, Ellen asked me to help create a governance protection agreement. I stared at him. A what? A legal safeguard. If anyone inside the company ever attempted to remove your ownership authority without proper approval, this agreement would automatically activate. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Ellen had never mentioned any of this, Michael continued. She was worried. Worried about what? She believed someone might eventually try to force you out of the company you built. The room suddenly felt very quiet. For months I had questioned myself. Maybe I was overreacting, maybe Ryan was simply ambitious. Maybe I was struggling to let go, but hearing those words changed everything. Ellen had seen something, and she had prepared for it. Michael opened another document. The agreement also allows an independent audit if ownership authority is challenged. I slowly looked through the paperwork. Every page carried Ellen's signature. Every page carried her protection. The first time since her death, I felt like she was still helping me, still watching over the company we built together. This means Ryan can't remove me? Michael shook his head. No. In fact, if these protections are triggered, the board will be required to review every major decision made during the transition. I sat back in my chair. Suddenly, the missing reports, the account changes, the secret meetings, and the public humiliation started looking very different. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this wasn't modernization, this was a takeover, and someone had anticipated it years ago. The following week, the governance agreement was formally activated. The board had no choice. An independent audit began. At first, Ryan acted calm. Vanessa acted even calmer. They told everyone the review was routine, nothing to worry about. But as auditors started requesting financial records, I noticed small changes. Ryan stopped smiling as much. Vanessa became defensive during meetings. Questions started appearing. Documents were requested, expenses were examined, and for the first time in months, the people who had pushed me aside looked nervous. I didn't argue, I didn't celebrate. I simply watched. Because deep down, I knew something important. The truth was finally moving, and once it started moving, nobody was going to stop it. 6 months later, Bennett Logistics was stronger than it had ever been. The board officially restored me as executive chairman, but I chose not to run the company alone. Instead, I created a leadership council where every major decision required transparency and accountability. Ryan stood before the board one final time. He looked older than I remembered. I thought I was saving the company, he said quietly. Instead, I nearly destroyed my family. I looked at my son for a long moment. You didn't lose this company because you made mistakes, I told him. You lost it because you forgot the difference between earning trust and taking control. He lowered his head. Vanessa resigned and quietly disappeared from the business world. The contracts she had arranged were canceled, and every dollar was recovered through legal action. Before leaving headquarters that evening, I walked into my old office and looked at Ellen's photograph. You protected us one last time, I whispered. For the first time in years, I felt peace. I realized the greatest legacy wasn't the warehouses, the trucks, or the millions we had earned. It was the values we built the company on: honesty, loyalty, and respect. Money can build a business, but only character can keep a family together. And that was the lesson my son would never forget.